Hey everyone, welcome in. Happy Friday. It's wonderful to see you all again. I think we have a couple more people coming out from the waiting room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, I think we're slowing up. So good afternoon. Welcome to Friday Office Hours. My name is Sam Stewart. I am a project manager here at the Data and Research Center. So if you're new to the All of Us Friday Office Hours, welcome. And if you're a veteran, welcome back. It's great to see you. We have a wonderful presentation today using All of Us survey data. So we're really excited to kind of dive into that. I'm going to plug a few things in the chat along the way. So the workspace that Andrew's going to go over is actually available to you. So I'll put that in the chat. But before we get started, I have a few announcements. Then I'll introduce our speaker and then punt it to him. We do kindly ask that you put all your questions in the general chat. And then if you have questions that you do have for Andrew or our survey team, that you wait to the final end of the presentation, and then we'll open it for open Q&A. As previously mentioned, we have a couple new features we're excited about in the All of Us Research program. So community is one of those features. You can now go to the User Support Hub and access a forum feature called the Community, in which you can get more information about what users are doing within the Researcher Workbench community. You can find a collaborator, you can add some helpful tips and tricks, or you can just ask the general community questions. You can follow the QR code, or if you go to the User Support Hub, at the very top right, there should be, it says community. Click on that, sign in using your @researchallofus.org account, and you're good to go. The next feature I'm going to also highlight is within the Researcher Workbench, now that you have the option to self-publish your workspace. So if you are a workspace owner and your project is in a pretty good part where you want to share with other researchers, you can publish your workspace. There are instructions on how to do this on the User Support Hub. It's just a few simple clicks, and then it's available for other researchers to view. If you have any questions or need assistance with publishing your workspace, feel free to follow that article or email us at support@researchallofus.org. And I hope you saw that our Research Roundup newsletter went out this week. There's some really fun things happening around the All of Us Research program, especially that will impact you as end users of the Researcher Workbench. So if you didn't get that newsletter, no worries. You can sign up for the Research Roundup newsletter here. That includes more feature offerings in the Researcher Workbench, some spotlights on current researcher progress, anyone that's published, and some funding opportunities. So that's a great thing to kind of see and get into your inbox each month. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. So now I'm going to introduce Andrew, who we're very excited to be with us today. So Andrew is a senior biostatistician with the Department of Biostatistics at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And a lot of members of the biostats department works with the All of Us research program. He has worked with AOU for over 4 years and has collaborated on many projects. He's currently working on several projects within Vanderbilt University Medical Center, including looking at topics with the nephrology department and the learning health systems. He has created a wonderful workspace and to explore survey modeling and survey scoring that he's going to highlight to use today. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and punt it on over to Andrew.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome out to Office Hours today. Thanks for the great introduction, Sam. And as Sam was saying, so I've been with Vandy for about 4 years now. Worked with all of us for the first 4 years of my time here. We recently have moved to other projects now, but I figured I'd take this moment to share some of the tools that I've been working with in all of us with you today, and to demonstrate a new workspace that I published in the community workspaces that Sam was talking about, that I think would be a very helpful way to introduce the idea of survey data. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do a few slides just sort of introducing surveys, what's available to use for us and all of us, ways to actually group some of these survey questions together into related ideas. And finally, we want to try to visualize how we can actually, so we want to try to visualize the survey responses so that we can get a better snapshot of the All of Us cohort as a whole. So After these slides, we're going to do a live demonstration of the community workspace that I made, which I think will be helpful, at least in showing you how to pull survey data from the all of us. And now none of this will make you an expert in survey data, but I hope it will at least give you a good introduction into the idea of survey data. So all of us has given several different surveys to its participants. Some of the examples include, but aren't limited to, the basics, which are just your demographics, age, gender identity, racial identity, etc., your overall health, lifestyle, medical history. There's one that came out kind of recently, which was about the COVID-19 experience. The one we're going to mostly focus on today is called the Social Determinants of Health, abbreviated SDOH. And these are going to be how social aspects in your life, such as your neighborhood, accessibility, your mental health, interactions with everyday people, discrimination people might face, and how that affects health rather than more clinical concepts. So, to be able to understand SDOH more, we need to think about the questions that make up this survey. And there's so many different questions that it's easy to get lost in the amount of material that's available in these surveys. So the big question we have is, how can we actually quantify responses from all the questions that we have in SDOH? And one of the ways we can do that is we can actually group questions with related topics into groups that we call survey scales. Now, survey scales weren't invented by all of us. These are all externally validated from prior research and published online. And it's from those prior publications that we can get some of the questions that we ask, and actually even some of the wording, so that we're asking it in the most fair way possible. So for an example, let's look for this group of questions that addresses how accessible somebody's neighborhood is. So if we look at the 5 questions I've posted here, they all deal with neighborhood accessibility, such as, do people have access to recreation? Can you bike in your neighborhood? Are there stores that are easy to walk to from your house? Are there sidewalks on most of your neighborhood? So for anyone who lives in Nashville, the answer is probably no. And the final one being, do you have access to public transportation? So what this scale does is all of the questions are related to this theme of neighborhood accessibility. And so typically if somebody has one of these items, like they have recreation or sidewalks or public transportation, they'll have the others, and vice versa. So people who don't have many of these facilities probably won't have most of them. So now we have this scale, but we have, unfortunately, categorical data that's very hard to visualize nicely. So how can we actually transpose these categorical responses into something more quantitative and continuous that we can actually visualize in an image? And the way we can do that is we can actually just assign numeric values to certain question responses, and we'll just call that score scaling. So for this, let's say we want agreement with these questions to be rated very highly. We want high numbers to correspond with high neighborhood accessibility. So we do that by giving people that disagree with the statements low scores, and people who agree with the statements very high scores. So here we can number all the responses from 1 to 4 to get more of a quantitative idea of how much people agree with the survey. And typically it's usually 1 to however many responses that survey question has. So if we now plot a histogram of the average scores within every ID that we have information on in all of us, we now can get a nice snapshot of how accessible are our cohort's neighborhoods. And as we can see, there's a lot of weight towards 3s and 4s, indicating that there's a good chunk of our cohort that has really accessible neighborhoods. They got sidewalks, they got recreation areas, but there's still a very noticeable weight toward the very left side of the distribution on the 1 weights, which sort of gives a polarized image of our cohort as a whole, where a lot of people do have access to recreation, but there's a significant number of people that just don't have any accessibility in their neighborhoods. So being able to do something like this takes that massive amount of survey data and lets us actually visualize it so we can sort of learn more about all of us. So we'll do another example here. Let's look at what's called the loneliness scale. Now, these 8 questions are going to relate to how lonely or socially isolated or withdrawn are our participants as a whole. So if you look at the majority of these questions, uh, they're going to have sort of negative wording or so to where if you respond positively, if you agree with the question, you say you often feel these things, that's going to correspond with higher loneliness. So let's look at number 3. How often do you feel left out? If somebody says, yeah, I feel left out all the time, that indicates more loneliness. If they say, oh no, I never feel left out, it's going to indicate less loneliness. However, unlike the last scale we took a look at, take a look at our bolded questions, number 6 and 8. Those are worded quite differently from the other questions. So let's look at number 6. How often do you feel that you're an outgoing person? Now, if you agree with the statement and you think, oh yeah, I'm often an outgoing person, that's going to have the opposite meaning of the other questions. It means that you're going to feel less loneliness. So we can't quite score this the same as the other survey scale because not all of the questions mean the same thing. So how do we deal with this? We can just simply do something called reverse scaling. So most of the questions we can score the same way as before, so we want higher numbers to mean more loneliness. So if somebody doesn't agree with the question, they get low scores. If they say they often agree with it, it gives high scores. But we go back to those positive worded questions about outgoingness and companionship, and we just flip the scores. So if they agree with the statement, we say low score, low loneliness. If they don't agree with it, that means high loneliness, high score. So when we do that, now all 8 questions mean the same thing. They're all on the same scale. And when we plot it, we get a more accurate depiction of loneliness within our All of Us cohort. So happily, there's very few people that feel really strong loneliness. And most of the people typically get between a 1 and a 2, but there's still a noticeable the peak of the distribution is not at the minimum level of loneliness. So now this can give us a nice picture of the mental health of our cohort. So this is all fine and good, but how do we actually get these ourselves? How do we actually code this data and use it in the Workbench? So next we're going to do a live demonstration of the community workspace that I've made for this purpose. And for those of you who are familiar with the Workbench and have access to it, this is actually readily available to you for you to be able to copy and work with as you want. So where this is available is, for those of you who do have Workbench accounts, all you have to do is go to the hamburger icon on the upper left-hand side of your screen. You can click on Featured Workspaces. The bottom, the newest available tool to us, the community workspaces. Click that, and we go to scoring. It's going to be called Scoring Measures from the All of Us Surveys. And we can always post a link in the chat or just email afterward for anyone that's interested in looking at this in greater detail. So when you actually go to the body of the workspace and look at the notebooks, you're going to see that there's 4 different surveys that we look at in All of Us. So, and there are scales that exist in social determinants of health, overall health, lifestyle, and the COVID-19 experience. Today, we're going to just be focusing on the social determinants of health, but the basic structure and setup of the notebook that you see today will be almost identical to the remaining notebooks. If you can understand the SDOH notebook we go through today, then it is trivial to understand the rest of them. So Workbench allows you to code in both R and Python. So we do have both versions available. I'm going to spend most of my time on the R version because that's the coding language that I'm personally more familiar with. We'll briefly touch on the Python today, but the coding in the Python will give you the exact same results as it will in R. So if we take a look at this notebook, we'll just take a couple seconds to load here. But luckily the environment's already set up, so it won't be a problem. All right, nice. So Now that we've loaded in our notebook, and we'll just quickly walk through some of the tools that are in this notebook, basically how to pull. So what we're going to do is every notebook is going to teach you is how to basically initialize your environment, how to extract the survey data that you're interested in analyzing into your local R or Python session. And then we're going to try to replicate some of the things I showed you in the slides. We're going to pull out the specific data related to some scales, display some of those questions, get some frequency tables going so we can see how the All of Us cohort responded to the questions. And we'll go through how we actually score some of the concept set scales and obtain that histogram that I showed you in the presentation. I've seen a couple people in the chat. I don't see scoring measures from the All of Us survey and community.
Hey Darcy, you could I'll send you the link, but you should be able to go to featured workspaces and it's there. But the link it's hyperlinked right above in the chat above. So try to access it directly from that URL and let me know if you have any issues.
Yeah, if anyone's trying to access this and they're having some issues, either with any coding issues or not being able to find it, yeah, please just let us know.
I'll note something else. It's in a controlled tier workspace. So if you only have registered tier access, you won't see this notebook or you won't see this workspace, just an FYI. So that might be the issue.
Sam, do we want to maybe we can post the URL for it?
Yeah, I'll do that now.
That'd be great, just in case people want to follow. It's so strange. Why am I seeing it and no one else is?
I think it was just one user, so no worries. Yeah.
Okay, some people are seeing it.
Yeah.
Nice, nice, nice. All right, so are we good to keep going?
All good.
All right, sounds good. So each of these notebooks is going to be set up in a very similar way, where we have a table of contents where every tab is going to be a different survey scale. So we're only going to look at the two that we saw in the PowerPoint today, because the rest of them are very similar to those two. So if you can understand how to be able to code up those two scales, you should be able to get the majority of the ones on the rest of the notebook. But if there are questions about doing another scale later or any of the other surveys, we should probably have time to be able to answer some of those. So the first thing we need to do every time we set up an R notebook or even a Python notebook in the Workbench is we need to basically initialize our environment. So for those of you who might not be as familiar with how the workspace works, how the Workbench works, is that all of us data itself is going to be stored on the cloud, and we need to be able to initialize our environment to be able to pull that information from the data set into our local R or Python environments. And the way we do that is going to be using a coding language called SQL or SQL. For those of you who haven't been able to use it yet, we aren't going to unfortunately be able to give you a full tutorial in SQL today, but we will be able to show you some of the very basic information that you would need to be able to pull data. And you really don't need advanced SQL knowledge at all. It's just very basic commands that will at least get the data into your environment. And then from there, you can use a preferred coding language that you might be more comfortable with. Of course, you can do all of this just directly in SQL too, but it's basically up to you what you're more comfortable with. So the first thing we're going to do is this code block here. This will display the current version of the data set that's available in All of Us. So we don't have to worry about what all that text string means. It just means that's the name of the current data set. And typically when you do work with data in the Workbench, you're just going to want to use the current data set. the only reason you'd ever want to go back to use a previous data set is, suppose you're doing a project that used a data set and then they updated that version of the data set later on. Then if you wanted to go back and use that data set that you started with, that would pretty much be the only reason I would recommend ever using an older data set, because every subsequent data release in all of us, they'll clean some of the data that might have had some errors. They're going to add new people in. They might remove a couple people that withdrew consent. So it's always best to just use the most up-to-date version. This block here is just going to take that data set name and do some initializations so that R knows where to pull the data from in the Workbench. And so next thing we got to do is, for those of you who use R, as you know, you need to load in some packages in order to be able to run effective code when using an R environment. And for those of you who are more used to R, you probably recognize some of these packages on here, like the tidyverse and ggplot packages. But the thing we're going to mostly focus on today in terms of pulling data is something called big R query. And what this is going to do is going to basically, in very basic and oversimplified terms, let R talk with where the data is stored and let you pull that into the environment. And so you don't have to worry about what it does. This code block here is just how I personally get data, use the package to get data from the cloud. There are multiple ways that you can do this. If you go to some of the featured workspaces in the Workbench, they code things up slightly differently. So there's not necessarily a one right way to do it. Whatever you're most comfortable with in terms of coding is the thing that will work best for you. But in very basic sense, this query function here is going to basically allow you to write SQL code within an R block in order to be able to pull data into R. And from there, then you can manipulate it using this environment. So now that we've gotten through all the code blocks here, we're ready to actually load in our data set. And we're going to use that query function above to write code that will select the necessary information that we want to have to be able to play with the survey data. So we're going to want 6 different columns here. So the first thing is we need the person ID, which is going to be a 7-digit ID number that every survey participant in all of us is assigned. We're going to want the survey name, which we're going to want to specifically look for the social determinants of health here. You'll see question and answer will be their own columns. So every row in all of us survey data corresponds to one question and answer concept. So it's going to be a long format. Every person ID will have multiple entries. The number of entries they have in the data set corresponds to how many survey questions in all of us that they answered. And the one thing I do want you all to pay attention to here, especially if you haven't used a lot of survey data or any data pulls in all of us before, is going to be the idea of a question and answer concept ID. Now, the real reason behind concept IDs are much more complicated. They deal with the structure of the data tables in the cloud. It's something called OMOP. That's going to be beyond the scope of this tutorial today. But the basic idea, the very oversimplified idea behind a concept ID is just think of it as a numeric ID that goes to each survey question and answer. So for instance, and this is completely hypothetical, but let's say you have a question called, what is your age? The ID for that would say, let's say that would be like something like 101. And what is your ethnicity? ID 102. What state are you from? ID 103, etc. So it's just a code that goes with every question that's in the data set. See a couple more comments. Yeah, that we're gonna, so we'll get to Python after we finished up the R notebook. So just answering a comment in the chat. Okay, so, and then as part of R, we're going to want to save the results of our query into a named data set. And here we'll just say it's called SDOH. And that will contain all the survey information from the social determinants of health. And for privacy's sake, I can't show you any individual level data just because there may be some people on the call that don't have access to the researcher workbench, and then privacy restricts us from being able to show you actual participant rows here. But what I can do is I can walk through this little SQL query here. So first we're going to want to do something called select, and that's going to let us pick the columns that we want to pull into R. So we're going to select all those columns that we were talking about before: person ID, the survey, the question and its concept ID, and the answer and its concept ID. And then we're going to want to pull data from the data table where the survey's data is located. And this is going to be something called DS survey. And then we're going to want, from there, we want to filter out just the social determinants of health. So we're going to do something called a where clause, which will let you filter what data, what rows you actually want. And we want the survey to be social determinants of health. Whenever you're working with survey data, I would recommend that you definitely just pick the survey that you want to look with, and don't ever try to download every single row from the DS survey table into your environment, because that is going to be millions upon millions of rows. And if you try to download something that's too big into the workbench, your environment is prone to crash. And you might get pinged by the security team asking if you're trying to download data from the workbench. So definitely try to filter out your SQL queries so that you're only picking the data that you want to wrangle with at that given time. So now that we've learned very briefly how to actually pull data into our environment, now we're going to work with a few of the scales. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to that neighborhood accessibility scale. The full name is the Physical Activity Neighborhood Environment Scale, which is abbreviated as PANES. And I'm going to I reproduced here the 5 questions that make up PANES, as well as their associated concept IDs. So in order to get just the questions related to PANES, we're going to go to the SDOH data set that we pulled, and we're going to filter down to the rows that just correspond to the 5 IDs that match up with the 5 survey questions. And then this code here will display each of the questions that are in the All of Us survey as they're written, as well as their associated concept IDs. So a trick to use with this concept IDs is whenever you're filtering big data sets, it's a lot easier to use the ID numbers to filter rather than the actual questions themselves. So when we filter using just these 5 numbers, the code looks very nice and neat. It's very easy to read and replicate. Imagine if we were trying to filter based on this whole block of text right here. Even just missing one ellipsis at the end, or having one space go wrong, or having one capitalization missed, and R is not going to be able to find that question. So whenever you're filtering data, it typically ends up being better to use the concept ID rather than search for really long question strings, because in the All of Us surveys, those questions can be really long, just so that they're asked in the most appropriate way possible. And this little link here, and these are going to be on every single scoring scale that we see in the notebooks, is where we actually got this scale from. So we click that. I'm not going to do that right now because it might boot me to another window, but that is going to be the research that we use to actually create this scale. So now that we have the data in our computer, we're going to just look at a few frequency tables to see how our participants responded to the questions. So what this little code chunk will do is it's just going to give you a basic frequency table of counts and percentages for the responses to the 5 questions. So you scroll down, now we can get nice little frequency tables for all the questions in the neighborhood accessibility scale. And let's do just a quick dive into the question on sidewalks. Are there sidewalks in the cohort streets? So if we look at the distribution of responses, we see about 2/3 of people either somewhat or totally agree that yes, their neighborhood has enough sidewalks on their streets. And then there's about a little bit more than a quarter of people either somewhat or strongly disagree. And they say, no, their neighborhood does not have good sidewalk coverage. Something new that we didn't talk about in the slides, or take a look at these last two response options. For every survey in all of us, there is the option for participants to say that they either would like to skip the question, they'd rather not give an answer, or that they just don't know what the answer to the question is. In this case, maybe people don't know if their neighborhood has lots of sidewalks. So for any question, people can choose to skip it. So we have about 2% of people who they opted not to respond to the questions, which seems like a small percent, but it is over 2,000 people, because we do have a good sample size for these surveys. So we have the frequency tables now, and now we want to actually score them so that we can get that nice quantitative distribution that we saw in the slides. So as a reminder, people that strongly agree with the question, we want to give them high scores, indicate high neighborhood accessibility. Low scores are for those who disagree, they have low neighborhood accessibility. And so here, this code block will basically create a new column that says, that maps the categorical response to their numerical continuous response. And something to note is that people who answered that they didn't know, or that they would prefer to skip the question, they're not able to be scored for that question because we don't know. We have no idea what their neighborhood accessibility is. And we can't give them a 0 because that would imply that their neighborhoods are very inaccessible. And we don't know that for sure. So if somebody skipped that question, they just get a blank for their score. And in order to recreate the histogram from the slides, what we do is we can just take the mean of the scores for everybody that we do have. And then when we make our histogram, we can use, for our users, you'll probably recognize ggplotcode, where we can plot all of the average scores, and then we are able to recreate the histogram from the slides. So that is how we do the neighborhood accessibility scale. I quickly want to jump to the loneliness scale, because that's, if you remember, that's the one that had some reverse coding that we needed to do. So here's the text for all of the 8 loneliness questions in conjunction with their concept IDs. So very similar to what we did before, we take the SDOH data set and we filter down to just those 8 question concept IDs. And if we look at the actual text of the question themselves, they're a little bit easier to manage than the neighborhood accessibility questions, which, if you remember, were very long and drawn out. But I would still recommend just using IDs to search and filter for questions rather than trying to search with the text strings. So if we look at some of the response frequencies, let's take a look at one of the ones where agreement corresponded with high loneliness. So how often do you feel left out? Luckily, many people in our cohort didn't feel left out too often. There's about just shy of 2/3 of the people said that they either never or rarely felt left out. And just about 1/3 said the opposite, where they sometimes or they often felt left out, with about 2% of people who preferred to skip the question. So that kind of matches the distribution that we saw in the histogram earlier, where the majority of people felt lower levels of loneliness. So if we scroll now to one of the reverse worded questions, where how often do you feel you're an outgoing person, which has more of a positive wording to it, now that you can see the weights have shifted in the response. So now about 80% of people say they either sometimes or often felt outgoing, indicating lower loneliness, and about 16% said that they never or rarely felt outgoing. So this, again, kind of shows you why we need to reverse code a couple of these questions, because if we just left them as they were, there wouldn't be much internal consistency between those two questions. They wouldn't be really considered related, and the scale as a whole wouldn't be a good reflection on loneliness in all of us. So in order to reverse code, just as a reminder, The scroll bar is very small. So we have, remember, those 6 concept IDs corresponding to the questions that were agreement was higher loneliness. We score, so never is 1, often is 4, and we scale up from there. And then the reverse coded questions, we flip it. And as we did before, people that said that they would prefer to skip the question are unable to be scored for that question. So the code's just a little bit more complicated because you have to consider both the categorical answer and whether that question in consideration is one of the reverse score questions or not. But it's not too much more to do to be able to get the scoring here. And as before, we just take the average of scores that people have. We do a GG plot, and we're able to get the distribution of that loneliness scale. And now I want to actually switch over to some Python code because I know that there might be some Python users in the chat. So I just want to touch base on the Python code, which is going to be very similar to the R in terms of its output. So let me open a Python notebook here. So we'll just take a couple seconds due to just how big the notebook is. All right, so this is going to look very familiar. It's going to have that same heading, same table of contents, and it's going to do pretty much the exact same things as R did, but it's going to use Python functions instead. So to set up, it's going to be the same as with R. We import the packages that we want to do. We want pandas data frames, and we're going to use matplotlib instead of ggplot. But so that's going to be the same idea where we need to bring in the tools that we need for data analysis, and then initializing the data set is the same thing. You just get the name of the data set from the environment. And the structure of the data is going to look very similar too. So it's a little bit different for how the wrapper you use for the SQL code. And this will be reading it in as from pandas data frame. But the actual SQL code itself is going to be virtually identical. You still have the same select statement where you have the 6 columns that you want to pull from, and then the only difference is that you have to put the data, you save the data set as a quantity we call data set here in all caps. That's the only thing that's any different from pulling it in Python versus R. But you still want to pull the DS survey table and then limit it to social determinants of health. So again, unfortunately, I am not able to show row level data due to privacy concerns, but it will have just the answers it'll just have the cells for all the columns that we see here. So you'd see ID names, the survey would all be SDOH, and then you would see the first few questions and answers and their corresponding IDs. So earlier, we jumped to the neighborhood accessibility section. Earlier, I showed you how to pull data in all the SDOH data into just one big data frame, and then from there use R to filter down to just the ones that were related to neighborhood accessibility. You can even skip that step and just simply directly queue up SQL to pull only the neighborhood accessibility questions. So what we can do is it's the exact same query as before, where we pull data for social determinants of health, but we use an AND clause to continue to refine our filter command. And we say that the question concept ID needs to be one of the 5 that is related to neighborhood accessibility. If we look at the frequency tables, you're going to notice that these look strikingly similar to the ones in R because they're the exact same. It's going to be just the same output, but a different way to get there. For scoring the data, I actually think it's a little easier to do in Python, even though I'm much more proficient in R, because it's just a simple, if this answer is strongly agree, make it a 4. If it's somewhat agree, make it a 3, etc. But if we plot the data, the distribution is going to look the exact same as it did in R, but the only difference is that this is made in matplotlib versus R is ggplot2. And as a reminder, if you're ever curious about where these scales come from, we have links to them in all the section headers. So all these notebooks and all the different scales are going to be performed very similar to these ones. There will occasionally be questions that need to be reverse scaled, but I wouldn't say that those are too common in any of these surveys. So that right there is a very brief overview of how to work with survey data in all of us, and basically some tools that you can use to both pull the data and manipulations that you can do for the data once you have it in your environment. Again, it won't make you an expert in survey data, but I hope this was at least a helpful tool in introducing the concept to you here. So thank you all for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions that you might have.